So in 2005, I found myself in Sydney, Australia. I'd gone to Sydney, Australia to really escape my life back here in England, just basically trying to numb myself and escape the things that had happened to me and the things I was doing to myself. I thought, no one knows me here, I can reinvent myself. And for a few months, I think I was doing okay. And then it got to December 2005, and I was ready to party. And this had been a common theme in my life. I would be, functioning alcoholic and addicted to drugs. But I was able to kind of, just about fit some work in on the weekly basis to kind of exist, really. 24/7, I would just be high and I would just be completely drunk. And for a time, I would get that euphoria and this feeling of happiness and meaning from the drugs and from the alcohol, from the clubs, from the women, from the peer groups I was involved in. But ultimately, what goes up must come down. And so every time I would get up to these points of highs, I would come down very, very quickly and I would crash really hard. And it got to the point where I was actually doing sometimes 3 days non-stop of just partying. I was living in a red light district in Sydney called King's Cross. And it is this party central, but it's also like Sodom and Gomorrah for anyone who understands the Bible. And it was just full of sin. And I just felt this sin heavy on my shoulders, and I felt like I was just, enveloped by this sin, and life didn't seem to have a future. And I stood there in the middle of all this kind of mayhem and all the party revelers walking past me, and I felt like I want to end it. And I remember thinking about how I could do it and how I could, get out of this life. And I remember thinking, what about God? What does God have to say about this? And in that moment, I genuinely believe that God spoke into my heart, into my spirit. I didn't hear an audible voice, but I felt it. And I felt like God said there and then in this red light district, if you want to live, give your life to me. And I just felt this kind of overwhelming sense of peace, that if I was to do that, everything would be okay. In that moment, I remember calling my mother, and it was like, I believe 7 or 8 in the morning in Sydney. And I called my mother back in England. And when she answered the phone, she said, "Oh, thank God. God told me to pray for you because he said you were going to take your own life." And it was like this realization in that moment that God, he was watching over me, that he knew what I was going through, and he knew that, I was ready to come back to him. And I gave my life to God in that moment, and from that day, I never touched drugs again. And I didn't drink for 4 years after that moment. And I went to a church called Hillsong in Sydney, and I walked in, and I remember feeling this overwhelming sense of love, just this wave of love coming from the back to the front. And I remember the people just smiling at me, and there was no judgment in their eyes. And that was something that I wasn't familiar with, because I felt this judgment from everybody that I would, encounter. You're just a loser, you're just a junkie or whatever. And I remember the person speaking from stage, he was given a message, but whilst he was giving this message, God intervened and he started to go on a tangent. And I remember listening to him, and I was still a bit high and still pretty drunk. And I remember, though, he was basically talking about my story, and he started to say, listen, you're a backpacker, you're from England, and God has a calling on your life, and if that is you, I want you to raise your hand and I want you to give your life to him. So that was like the second confirmation that God is calling me, and I just said, yeah, here I am. I had this real come to Jesus moment, and my life was never the same again. So let's fast forward to December 2016. Up until this point, I had a very blessed life. I was now married, got a beautiful daughter who's 7 years old. I'd had so much favor in my career, and I had so much to be grateful for. But there was something in me that had changed since I'd gotten saved. And really, when I'm honest with myself, I had lost my first love of Jesus. And I'd started to look around me at the world, especially in the business world, and I'd started to see all this affluence and this power. And I had slowly drifted away from my belief that God was my core and that God was everything I needed. And I'd started to look for worldly wisdom outside of the church and outside of my relationship with God. And so in 2016, I made this decision that I wanted to leapfrog where I was, and I wanted to start buying up companies. Got to a point where I had found an opportunity to buy a business in the United States, and we were in negotiations with the founders of this business. We then sat in front of one of the biggest investment banks in LA and pitched them our deal, and miraculously to me, they agreed to finance our transaction. And I felt this sense of pride rise up in me, which said that all the people that had ever doubted me, all the people that said that I was a dreamer, that I couldn't achieve things, I had silenced them and that I had won. And in that moment, there was no part of me that was thinking about God helping me to do this, or that God had given me favor. I felt like I'd done it, and it was in my own strength. And I flew back to the UK, and I felt like, yeah, I'm going to start this new life. And I definitely wasn't consulting God on what he wanted or what he had planned for me. Fast forward a couple more months, and by September of 2017, this deal had started to unravel. I received a phone call one day to essentially share with us that one of the individuals in this transaction had committed fraud. Essentially, if we were to move forward with this transaction, things were going to get really bad really quickly. I had basically bet all my chips that this one was the winning hand. And I'd just been told that I'd lost and someone had the ace. And it was brutal. And I remember feeling like my world was crumbling and someone had just pulled the rug from underneath me. I felt like I'd let down my family. I felt like I'd let down my wife, my daughter, and I felt like I was a failure and that people were going to laugh at me. And then to top it all off, as the months continued on, all of my business deals and operations that I was involved in started to unravel too. So by the end of 2017, I basically had lost almost everything I'd been working on. And again, I felt like I'd come to the end of my tether. In a different sense, before I had addictions and I was kind of like a hopeless type of individual, but now I felt like I'd lost my sense of meaning, and I just didn't know who I was supposed to be. I didn't know how to turn this situation around. So over the next year, I went on a journey of surrender, where I felt like I was having to start again. I felt like I was having to pull off another layer of the onion. I felt like as soon as I thought, I dealt with this issue in my life or this feeling or this belief, there was another one that I had to get rid of. And I had to get down on my knees and apologize again to God. And I would get angry, I would get frustrated, I'd feel confused, I'd get sad, and then I'd feel this sense of peace. And ultimately, even in this whole year, my business has completely imploded at this point. I barely earned anything for the next 12 months. But God never let me down. I never went without and pay our bills. But yeah, it was brutal. But I don't regret it for a moment, and it's been my saving grace. So for anyone who's listening to this now, you may be a man, you may be a woman, you may have had a successful career or business, you may be struggling right now. There's one thing that I know more than anything else. You can look anywhere else you want in the world. You can look outside of yourself. You can look to science. You can look to business. You can look to career. You can look to all these different experts and gurus out there, and you'll keep finding dead ends. God, he's our maker, and his Bible is the maker's manual. And that's the big, secret that everybody's trying to find. And we have it right here. God loves us. He created us, and he has a plan and a purpose for our life. And when we seek first the kingdom of heaven and we seek first, his glory, everything else that we need in life will be given to us. And, the strange thing is now, I'm not a rich man, but I'm really rich in the life that I have. I have a beautiful family, I have great friends and community, and I just really have this sense of peace. And that really is just such an incredible thing, because I think for so many people all over the world, they're striving and they're struggling to try and attain, this thing that they can't even explain. They don't need to do that. They just need to surrender. And I can promise you this much: life is not designed to be easy. Life is gonna have its ups and downs. But life is so much better when you're doing it with God.